When I told people I was retiring to the Philippines alone at 62, most of them laughed, not unkindly. Just that kind of nervous laugh people do when they don't know what else to say. My son-in-law, Jason, was the most direct about it. He looked at me across the dinner table one Sunday evening in November, put down his fork, and said, "Ray, you've never even been to Asia." He wasn't wrong. I'd spent 34 years working as a civil engineer for the city of Edmonton. I knew cold. I knew gray skies from October to April. I knew the commute on Whitewood Drive in -30 weather. The kind of cold that makes your car groan when you start it. The kind that seeps through your jacket before you've even reached the front door. Sandra and I had talked about retirement for years, the two of us sitting at the kitchen table with brochures about BC, about the Okanagan, maybe somewhere with a little more warmth. Then Sandra passed in the spring of 2021, and those brochures sat in the kitchen drawer for about 2 years before I finally threw them out. I wasn't looking for anything dramatic. I wasn't trying to reinvent myself or run away from grief. At least, that's what I told myself. What I was doing was watching YouTube at 11 o'clock at night because sleep had become something that happened to other people, and I stumbled onto a video of a Filipino market. Just a man walking through rows of mangoes and papayas and fresh fish, the kind of fish that looked like it had been pulled out of the ocean that same morning, and vendors calling out prices in pesos that, when I converted them in my head, made me sit up straighter. A kilogram of bangus for less than $2. A whole pineapple for 60 cents Canadian. I watched that video 3 times. Then I watched about 400 more over the next 6 months. I'm not someone who makes impulsive decisions. I spent my career calculating load tolerances and drainage gradients. I make lists. I weigh options. But there's a kind of slow-building decision that doesn't feel impulsive, even when it looks that way from the outside, and by the time I booked my flight to Cebu in the spring of 2023, I had done more research than I'd done on anything since my thesis in 1987. I knew about the special resident retirees visa. I knew the average cost of a furnished apartment in Cebu City versus Dumaguete versus Davao. I had spreadsheets. I had a folder on my laptop called Philippines Research with 47 subfolders. What the spreadsheets could not prepare me for was everything else. The morning I flew out of Edmonton International, it was -11. My daughter, Kayla, drove me to the airport. She didn't say much on the way. Kayla has always been the quiet one, the one who processes things internally and comes back to you 3 days later with a very organized set of concerns. She hugged me at the departure's door and held on a beat longer than usual, and when she pulled back, she looked at me and said, "Just promise me you'll answer your phone." I promised. I had 2 checked bags and a backpack. Everything else I had given away or put in storage. The storage unit was costing me $220 a month, which at the time felt like a temporary measure, and now, honestly, feels like something I probably should have just emptied. The first problem appeared before I even boarded the plane in Vancouver. I was connecting through Narita, and the airline agent at the international check-in counter in YVR asked me for proof of onward travel. I had read about this. The Philippines requires tourists to show a ticket out of the country, and since I was arriving on a tourist visa initially, I needed to have something. I had purchased what's called a dummy onward ticket a week before leaving. It's a real reservation that you hold for a short period before it expires, and I had the confirmation on my phone. I pulled it up. She looked at it. She typed. She looked at it again. "This departs from Cebu," she said. "You're arriving in Manila." I had booked the wrong departure city. There were about 40 seconds there that I would rather not relive. Standing at a check-in counter in an international airport with a boarding pass I couldn't use, a ticket out of the wrong city, and the quiet awareness that the man behind me in the queue was sighing with increasing frequency. I explained the situation to the agent as calmly as I could. She made a phone call. I stood there. Another agent came over. They looked at my documentation, conferred quietly, and ultimately decided that because I also had the SRV application paperwork showing my intention to apply for retirement residency, they would allow me through. I walked to my gate and sat down and stared at the departures board for a while. That was the first lesson. Research is not the same as readiness. The flight from Vancouver to Tokyo was 9.5 hours. From Tokyo to Manila, another 4. By the time I cleared immigration in Ninoy Aquino International Airport and collected my bags and stepped outside into the Manila heat, I had been traveling for somewhere close to 22 hours. And the heat? I need to try to describe the heat accurately. Edmonton in August gets warm. 30 degrees, sometimes a bit more, and it feels like a gift after the winter. Manila in May is not that. It is not temperature as a number on a thermometer. It is a presence. It sat on me the moment I walked through those sliding glass doors, thick and wet and immediate. And within about 90 seconds, my shirt was damp. I stood on the pavement outside the terminal and thought, I live here now. The taxi to my hotel took nearly an hour due to traffic, and the driver and I had a conversation that was friendly and largely nonverbal, which I mean sincerely as a compliment to both of us. His English was serviceable, and my Tagalog was non-existent, and we managed through gestures and goodwill and one very effective shared laugh when I asked him something about the fare, and he answered something about basketball. I still don't know exactly what either of us said, but we both thought it was funny, and that helped. The hotel was fine, clean, air-conditioned, reasonably priced. I got to my room, set my bags down, sat on the bed, and stared at the wall for probably 10 minutes. I wasn't sad. I wasn't frightened. I was something harder to name, a kind of profound awareness that I had stepped entirely outside the life I had known for 6 decades, and there was no automatic return button. In Edmonton, I knew where the good Ukrainian dealers were. I knew which Tim Hortons had the fastest drive-through. I knew my neighbors. I knew my doctor's direct line. Here, I didn't know how to hail a tricycle, or what a reasonable price for one was, or whether the water from the tap was safe to drink, or where I would go if I felt sick. The answer to that last question would become relevant sooner than I expected, but I'll get to that. The next morning I woke up at 4:30, because my body still thought it was yesterday in a completely different time zone. I lay in bed for a while, then gave up and got dressed and went outside. And this is the part that surprised me. The city was already moving, vendors setting up, jeepneys beginning their routes, a woman sweeping the pavement in front of her small shop, methodically, the way someone sweeps when it is simply what the morning requires. I walked for about 40 minutes without a plan, and at some point I turned a corner and found a small market. Not a tourist market, just a neighborhood one, the kind with tarps for roofs and folding tables and old plastic crates and the smell of fish and citrus mixing together in a way that should have been strange but wasn't. I stopped and just looked. There were vendors I recognized from those YouTube videos. The mangoes piled in careful pyramids, the bundles of kangkong, the whole fish laid out on ice with their eyes still clear and bright. And there were things I didn't recognize at all. Fruits and vegetables whose names I didn't know yet. Dark purple things that turned out to be purple yam. Yellow things I eventually learned were pomelo. Green things that took me another 2 weeks to correctly identify as bitter melon. I bought a bag of small bananas and 2 mangoes and paid about 40 pesos total, which I had to calculate twice because I couldn't quite believe it. That's less than $1 Canadian for a bag of bananas and 2 mangoes. The entire transaction took longer than it needed to because I counted out the coins slowly and carefully like a child making their first purchase, and the vendor watched me with patient amusement and did not hurry me at all. When I finally handed her the right amount, she smiled and said something I didn't understand and gave me an extra small banana. I walked back to my hotel eating a mango with my hands, which I have never done in my life before that morning, and I felt something I hadn't felt in quite a long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than happiness. Something like the beginning of belonging somewhere. The first 2 weeks were an education in how many things I had always done on autopilot. Buying groceries, getting from one place to another, finding somewhere to eat, communicating a need to someone who may or may not share my language. Every one of these things, which I had done without thinking for the better part of 60 years, suddenly required conscious effort. It was exhausting in a way I hadn't anticipated, not physically, but mentally. By 7 in the evening, I was tired in a way I hadn't been since my early years in the workforce. But here is what I also noticed. Each time I figured something out, something that had seemed impossible in the morning, I went to bed having learned one more thing I could actually do. I learned how to flag down a jeepney and figure out the fare. I learned that the tricycle drivers outside my neighborhood had a rough standard rate, and that smiling and paying it without haggling on the first ride meant they started recognizing me and became genuinely helpful. I found a small carinderia, a kind of simple local canteen, 3 blocks from my temporary apartment, where the woman who ran it, whose name I eventually learned was Rosita, would point to the dishes she'd made that day, and I would point back and somehow always end up with something good. There is a pace to daily life here that is fundamentally different from the pace I'd lived for 6 decades in Canada, and adjusting to it took longer than I expected. Not because the pace is worse, because it's different in a way that requires you to actually change, not just tolerate. In Edmonton, I operated on a schedule. Meetings at 8, lunch at 12, out by 5:30, groceries on Thursday, hockey on Saturday. The whole architecture of a life organized around efficiency. Here, things take the time they take. The repair you were told would be ready by Tuesday is ready by Thursday. The office you need to visit closes for lunch at a time that wasn't posted anywhere visible. The generator cuts out for 40 minutes in the afternoon with no explanation, and comes back on just as you're deciding what to do about it. I spent the first month finding this irritating. Then I spent the second month finding it less irritating. Somewhere in the third month I stopped noticing it. What I started noticing instead was this. People here talk to each other. Not just transactionally, not just to communicate information, but actually talk. My neighbor, an older man named Ernesto, who had worked on a merchant vessel for 20 years and spoke English with an accent I found immediately charming, came over the first week with a plate of food his wife had made and sat on my small porch and talked with me for an hour and a half about the Philippines, about Canada, about the difference between working in Japan and working in the Netherlands, about what he missed about being at sea and what he didn't miss at all. I did not ask him to come over. He simply came. In Edmonton, I had lived in my house for 11 years and knew my neighbors well enough to wave. There was a quality of human contact here that I hadn't known I was missing until I found it again. Or maybe for the first time. I'm still not entirely sure. My daughter called every few days in the beginning. Kayla has her mother's habit of framing concern as information, so the calls would begin with questions about practical things. Was I eating properly? Was the water safe? Had I found a doctor? And underneath those questions was the real question, which was, are you okay and do you need to come home? The honest answer to the first part varied. The honest answer to the second part was always no. But I also wasn't going to tell her about the evenings. The evenings were harder than I had expected. During the day there was always something to do, some problem to solve, some small adventure to navigate. In the evenings I would sit on my porch and the city would get quieter, and in that quiet I would sometimes think about Sandra. Not with acute grief, that particular sharpness had softened over time, but with a kind of low, steady awareness of her absence. This was the life we had talked about. Not the Philippines specifically, but this idea of somewhere warm, somewhere with good food, somewhere to sit outside in the evening. She would have loved the mangoes. She would have driven me completely insane by spending 45 minutes at the market asking the vendors detailed questions about every unfamiliar vegetable. And I would have been impatient about it, and then secretly grateful, because I would have learned twice as much. I thought about that a lot in those early evenings. I also discovered something about myself that I hadn't expected. I was lonelier than I'd been willing to admit. Not all the time, not most of the time, but in specific moments. When something funny happened, and there was no one to tell, when I made a small breakthrough with my jeepney navigation, and had no one to share the slightly absurd pride of it, when I sat in a restaurant and watched families eating together. In those moments, I felt the particular loneliness of being 62 years old in a foreign country, starting from the very beginning. My son Daniel was less diplomatic than Kayla about all of this. He called about twice a month and spent approximately 60% of each call asking me to explain my financial situation in more detail than I had provided. He's an accountant, which has made him a valuable person in my life and also, at times, a very tiring one. He wanted to know exactly what my CPP was getting me, what the pension was converting to in pesos, whether I had travel medical coverage that was adequate for long-term stay rather than short-term travel. All fair questions, all things I had already researched, but I answered them again because he needed to hear the answers from me, not from a spreadsheet. The financial reality, since this comes up, is this. My civil service pension, combined with CPP that I'd deferred until 62, put me at just under $3,000 Canadian a month. In Edmonton, that would have been a modest retirement. Comfortable, but not easy, particularly with property taxes and heating bills, and the general cost of keeping a house maintained through an Alberta winter. In Cebu, living in a comfortable one-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood close to a large supermarket and a hospital, eating well, keeping a small emergency fund, occasionally flying somewhere in the region. $3,000 a month meant I was living better than I had in my last decade of working. My rent was roughly 9,000 pesos a month, which at the time of writing this is somewhere around $220 Canadian. My groceries, buying a mix of local markets and the imported Canadian things I occasionally needed for my own sanity. Real cheddar, decent coffee, ran perhaps another 200. Utilities were negligible. I hired a woman named Perla to clean twice a week, not because I couldn't clean my own apartment, but because it was 180 pesos per visit, which is about $4.50, and because I genuinely liked talking with her. Jason, my son-in-law, came around eventually. He and Kayla visited in December, the first Christmas. They arrived skeptical. I could see it in the careful, controlled way Jason looked around my apartment when they first walked in, cataloging, assessing, and left, I think, genuinely surprised. Not that everything was perfect, not that I had found paradise, but that I had found a life. That the man who had been sitting in a big quiet house in Edmonton eating reheated soup alone in the evenings had somehow turned into a person who knew his neighbors, had a favorite market stall, had a doctor he trusted, and a regular morning walk, and a small group of other expats he met for dinner on Thursdays. "It suits you," Jason said on their last morning. We were sitting outside with coffee, watching the street begin its day. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said, "Yeah, I think it does." The first real test, the moment that showed me something about what I'd actually become here, came about 7 months in. I woke up on a Tuesday with a fever. Not a dramatic fever, just an insistent one, the kind that doesn't knock you down, but makes you feel thick and slow, and a little uncertain. Back in Edmonton, I would have known exactly what to do. Calm down, maybe called HealthLink 811, maybe driven to my clinic, where my doctor of 15 years had my complete file and knew my medical history back to a childhood ear infection. Here, I wasn't sure where to go. A year earlier, that uncertainty would have panicked me. I can say that honestly. The idea of being sick and alone in a foreign country at 62, without the safety net of a system I understood, was one of the fears I had carried onto the plane. What I actually did was text Ernesto, who immediately came over, assessed me with the practical calm of a man who had dealt with medical situations at sea for 2 decades, and drove me to a private clinic nearby that he said was reliable. The doctor there was a young woman who had done part of her training in Singapore, spoke excellent English, and did not make me feel like a fool for not knowing how the system worked. She diagnosed me with a straightforward respiratory infection, prescribed medication, told me to rest and drink more water, and charged me a fee that was, in total with the medication, less than $40 Canadian. I sat in the back of Ernesto's car on the way home and thought, I handled that. Not elegantly, not without needing help, but I handled it. I knew who to ask. I knew enough about where I lived to access what I needed. I was sick and alone in a foreign country, and I managed, not because the system was perfect, and not because everything went smoothly, but because I had built enough of a life here that I had people to call and places to go. That mattered more than I can properly explain. There's a particular failure of imagination that I think happens to people as they get older, including me. The future starts to look like a narrowing of what's already there, rather than an opening into something new. You tell yourself the logic of it. You've invested in this place, these people, this system. The familiarity itself becomes a kind of asset. And it is an asset, but it can also become a fence you stop noticing because you built it gradually, one logical decision at a time. I had started building that fence without realizing it. Declining invitations because going out took effort, watching the same kind of television, eating the same rotation of meals because experimenting required buying ingredients I might not use, making the same drive to the same grocery store and walking the same route through it, always starting in produce, always ending at the checkout in the far left corner. Moving to the Philippines broke all of that, not because the Philippines is magical. It isn't. In the way tourists mean that word. It's a real country with real problems. The traffic in Cebu City can be genuinely maddening. The bureaucracy for visa renewals requires patience I didn't know I had. There are days when the heat is simply too much, and I sit inside with the air conditioning on, feeling slightly defeated. There are things I miss about Canada that are not trivial. My daughter's cooking on Christmas, the particular silence of an Edmonton morning after fresh snow, the way a Tim Hortons coffee tastes when it's so cold outside that the cup warms your hands through your gloves. No place is perfect. I don't say that as a disclaimer. I say it because I think it's actually the point. I didn't come here to find a perfect place. I came because I had stopped growing where I was, and I could feel it. The way you feel a muscle that hasn't been used in too long, that slight ache of something unused. And the only honest cure for that wasn't a better neighborhood in Edmonton or a condo in Kelowna. It was something that would require me to actually try. I've been here for 14 months as of this recording. I have a one-bedroom apartment with a small balcony where I drink my coffee every morning and watch the street below. I know the vendors at my neighborhood market well enough that the man who sells fish has started saving the best pieces for me when he knows I'm coming. I've ridden jeepneys across the city and gotten lost and found my way back. I've navigated the SSS office and a bank account opening and a visa renewal and a landlord negotiation, all in a country where I didn't speak the primary language and where every process worked differently from what I knew. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, something happened that I'm still trying to put into words. I stopped waiting. I think that's the best way I can describe it. In Edmonton, after Sandra died, I had been waiting without realizing it, waiting for something to make the decision for me, for circumstances to shift, for a reason to do the thing I was considering. I was 62 years old and retired, and I had more time than I'd had in 30 years, and I was waiting. Here, I stopped. Not because everything was easy, because every day something required me to act, to decide, to try. And in acting, in deciding, in trying, I stopped being a man who was waiting for his life to begin again. Kayla asked me a few months ago, during one of our video calls, whether I had any regrets. I thought about it seriously. There are things I would do differently. I would sort out the onward ticket issue more carefully before arriving at the airport. I would budget the first 3 months more loosely, because there are setup costs no spreadsheet fully accounts for. I would have pushed harder to learn at least conversational Cebuano before arriving, because the goodwill it generates is worth more than any amount of research. But do I regret getting on the plane? I thought about Sandra, and the brochures in the kitchen drawer, and the cold that had felt so permanent for so long, and Ernesto sitting on my porch talking about the Merchant Marine, and Rosita pointing to the best dish of the day, and the way those mangoes taste at 6 in the morning when the city is just waking up, not for a single second. There's a thing people say about retirement, that it's a reward for the work you've already done, a chance to rest. I believed that for a while. I don't anymore. What I've found here, what I didn't know I was looking for when I booked that flight, wasn't rest. It was evidence. Evidence that at 62, after 34 years, and a long grief and a big quiet house in Edmonton, I was still capable of building something new. That's not something anyone told me before I left. That's not something I found in the research folders, or the spreadsheets, or the YouTube videos at 11 o'clock at night. That's something you only find by going.